The wind howled across the top of the wall, whistling through the cracks between ice blocks as if voicing the anguish of ages. Night was falling, and in the dying light of the sun, one could see the vast northern expanse stretch into ghostly white plains. Jon Snow stood on the walkway, the frosty air biting at his cheeks, while he gazed out over the bleak horizon. Snow was drifting down in large clumps, making a soft hush as it accumulated on the upper platform. The cold seared through every layer he wore, but he did not let it chase him inside. He refused the refuge of the warmth of Castle Black's interior. The stakes were too high to retreat to comfort. If the realms of men were to make a final stand, he needed to see the threat with his own eyes. He could sense that something momentous was drawing near, as if the entire world were inhaling in dread anticipation. The White Walkers had been active, their scattered sightings converging into a clarion call that winter was truly here. Whispers brought tidings of a silent march from the far north, and rumors that the Night King himself led the dead. Jon had never met him face to face, only glimpsed his formidable presence at Hardhome. That nightmarish memory had been enough. He had seen how the Night King raised the dead effortlessly, an indifferent expression marking his icy features. Since then, Jon had known the final confrontation was only a matter of time. Castle Black was overwhelmed by a sense of frantic preparation. Many of the Night's Watch brothers patrolled the battlements, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign. Beneath them, the courtyard bustled with the forging of dragonglass spearheads and the distribution of crude but vital armaments. They had no illusions about the odds. Even with the support of the free folk, the handful of men left in the watch were few. News traveled slowly through the Seven Kingdoms, and the lords to the south, embroiled in their own wars, had not fully understood the magnitude of the danger. Jon Snow's pleas for men, for resources, had yielded meager results. With Daenerys Targaryen occupied in the south after her own bitter struggles, the Wall stood nearly alone. The day before, the howling winds had carried faint shrieks, sounds that set even the bravest soul's teeth on edge. Tormund Giantsbane had come to stand beside Jon, scowling into the distance. "You feel that chill, Jon Snow?" Tormund had grumbled. "A cold so sharp it cuts you from the inside." Jon had merely nodded. He felt it, too. A swirling dread, a prophecy of doom that manifested in the marrow of his bones. For the moment, though, the hush was profound. Snow fell in lazy swirls, and the occasional caw of a raven punctuated the silence. Jon rested his gloved hands against the rim of the ice blocks, leaning forward slightly to peer north. Ghost, his direwolf, padded along the walkway behind him, silent except for the low, rumbling breath he exhaled in plumes of vapor. The direwolf's red eyes gleamed in the fading twilight, luminous and watchful. Jon thought about how much had changed since he first came to the Wall. Back then, he had been an arrogant boy believing he was an honorable bastard. Now he had faced truths about his lineage, the fragility of alliances, and the existential threat that loomed. The past few moons had tested his resolve more than he ever imagined possible. He recalled Samwell Tarly's pale face when news of yet another village's destruction by the Whites had reached them. Sam had pored over old texts, rummaging for lore on the others, the long night, the forging of Valyrian steel, anything that could offer an edge. Gilly had hovered near him, worry etched on her features. They had a child to protect, after all, and each day the sense of finality grew stronger. Jon had spent hours conferring with the few maesters and wise men at Castle Black, gleaning any knowledge that might tip the scales. Word had spread that one way to truly defeat the White Walkers was with Valyrian steel or dragonglass, and they had made as many weapons as possible. A small stockpile of dragonglass daggers, arrowheads, and spear points lay in chests in the armory. Longclaw, once the ancestral sword of House Mormont, hung at Jon's side, its pommel shaped like a snarling direwolf. Crafted of Valyrian steel, it was possibly their most potent asset. But one blade, no matter how fabled, was still just one blade. Jon lingered on the wall until the last threads of daylight vanished. The sky overhead turned black, and a sea of stars rippled beyond the swirling snow clouds. The day's watch ended, and the night's watch began. At the foot of the steps, Tormund greeted Jon in the courtyard. Torches had been lit, casting flickering orange across the thick snow. Several of the free folk huddled around a fire. Others hammered away on the last bits of dragonglass to shape them into something lethal. Jon felt a pang of gratitude that they had remained, that even as winter's jaws closed, these men and women refused to desert the fight they believed in. "This is the calm," Tormund said in a low rumble, "before the biggest storm of our lives." Jon nodded. He found himself too weary for stirring speeches. He wanted to ease Tormund's worries, but there was no sugarcoating what was to come. Instead, he placed a hand on Tormund's shoulder. "We stand together. That's all we can do." They parted ways with a mutual understanding, Tormund vanishing into the cluster of men. Jon headed to the temporary command room in the King's Tower. As he entered, the warm glow of candles illuminated a small table littered with maps. Sam stood by the table, looking up anxiously. "There's talk of movement in the haunted forest," Sam said, voice trembling slightly. "The Free Folk Rangers say they saw shapes out in the snow earlier today. They could be wights." Jon exhaled, a heaviness settling in his chest. "How close?" "Close enough that we might see them by dawn," Sam said. Then, as though reading Jon's deeper concern, Sam's eyes flitted to meet Jon's. "What do we do if he comes?" Jon ran a hand through his dark hair, which had grown longer these days, curling against his collar. "We hold. We wait. We keep archers on the wall. If it's him, if it's the Night King, this war might be decided right here. Or it might only begin." He paused, eyes dropping to the map. "We can't let them through. If they break the wall, all the realms of men are lost." Sam's face tightened in resolve. He held out a small leather pouch. "This is more dragonglass dust. I've been told if you can get it into wounds, it hinders their healing. Or their necromancy or something. It's not precise in the texts, but we can't ignore any possibility." Jon took the pouch. "Thank you, Sam." He clapped his friend lightly on the shoulder. "You should rest. Gilly and the baby." "I'll rest after," Sam said quietly. "Or if I can. But there's more I can read. If there's any hint of how the first long night ended, maybe there's a detail I've missed." Jon nodded, knowing that Sam's determination stemmed from both courage and fear. "Don't overexert yourself," Jon said softly. "We're going to need you in one piece." Sam gave him a grave smile, then turned back to the table, flipping through the pages of an ancient, leather-bound tome. Jon left him to his studies and made his way up a set of narrow stairs leading to a dim corridor. A single torch sputtered in its iron sconce. His chamber was small, sparse, a single cot, a table, and a chest. Ghost brushed past him, settling near the door. Jon sat on the edge of his cot, taking a moment to inhale and exhale, feeling the tightness in his shoulders and chest. Memories assailed him. The Battle of the Bastards, the chaos at Hardhome, Ygritte dying in his arms, the moment he was named king in the north by men who followed him out of respect for Ned Stark's memory, only to lose that title in the turmoil of alliances. And then his discovery of who he truly was, how it might threaten all he'd believed about himself. None of it mattered now. He was here at the wall, with or without any great title, facing a foe that saw no distinctions between lords and peasants, between bastards and trueborn sons. Sleep was elusive. It always was on nights like this, on the precipice of confrontation. At last, exhaustion took over, though rest came with uneasy dreams of ice and shadows, of an endless void. When he awoke, the pale light of dawn filtered through the narrow window slit. He heard muffled commotion outside. Yells, hurried footsteps, the clang of metal. Alarmed, he bolted upright, grabbed Longclaw, and rushed to the courtyard. The day was a swirl of snow and dreadful activity. Men were arming themselves, and the watchmen on the outer ramparts shouted hurried warnings. Tormund spotted Jon and bellowed, "They're at the edge of the forest! Hundreds of them, maybe more." A hush followed his words, as if they all realized that this was indeed it, the moment they had dreaded. Jon ascended a flight of stairs to the top of the wall, breath coming in short puffs in the bitter cold. The morning light revealed, below, a sight of pure horror. Dark, moving silhouettes trudged through the snow, an army of the dead stretching far across the plains. Some wore tattered clothing from forgotten battles. Others were little more than skeletons with scraps of flesh. White walkers on skeletal horses formed a sort of vanguard, their pale, crystalline flesh reflecting the dim sunlight. And there, near the center of the host, towered a figure that made John's heart contract. Stark white hair, translucent skin, eyes of deep blue, and clad in a malevolent aura of winter's chill. The Night King. John's mouth went dry. He had foreseen this day, imagined it in nightmares, but the scale of the threat stunned him into silence momentarily. Each step the undead took brought them closer to the ancient fortress. Though the wall had stood for thousands of years, fear crept in that perhaps this time it might not prevail. But he was not alone. Along the parapets, archers readied fire arrows, barrels of pitch were set, and the clang of steel rose from those in the courtyard preparing for the confrontation. As the whites advanced, a maddening hush accompanied them. No savage war cries, no roars of beasts, just the soft rustle of countless undead feet through the snow. John walked the length of the wall's summit, calling out orders to the men. Fire arrows to begin with, dragonglass arrows if possible. If the White Walkers advanced, the defenders were to hold until the last possible moment and then retreat into the interior if needed. He looked to the southwestern side, where catapults had been positioned, loaded with barrels of flaming pitch laced with dragonglass shards. "Wait until they're in range," John commanded. "We do as much damage as we can from here." Soon, a horn blast echoed across the cold air. It was the age-old warning of the Night's Watch, signaling the approach of the others. Any man who had heard it before knew it was the clarion call of horror. John steadied himself, bracing for what was to come. Tormund joined him, eyes scanning the horde. "How many?" Tormund asked, though it was clear he knew the answer. "Too many." Below, the White Walkers paused. Their pale steeds stomped restlessly, producing no visible vapor in the bitter cold, as if dead themselves. The Night King's posture seemed almost regal as he surveyed the wall, that ancient barrier of men's might. His lips were thin, parted in what might have been the ghost of a sneer. Then, very slowly, he raised one arm, a silent command. The whites surged forward. The defenders loosed their first volley of arrows. A rain of fire and dragonglass rained down upon the undead ranks, splintering bones and shattering torsos, setting ablaze the brittle flesh of the front lines. Some whites collapsed instantly, their forms crumbling into inert lumps. Yet more pressed forward, undeterred by the flames. This was the terror of facing the dead. They did not waver, did not flinch. Pain, fear, exhaustion, none of these existed for them. At intervals, the catapults released their blazing barrels. Fire and shards of dragonglass spewed across the battlefield, creating small pockets of devastation. John saw White Walkers skirting the edges of those flaming hazards, eerily calm as they guided their horses. The watchers on the wall pressed their advantage as best they could, hoping to weaken the undead ranks before they reached the fortifications. But the onslaught was relentless, even as swaths of whites fell more advanced. Soon they were at the base of the wall. At any other time in history, the ancient enchantments woven into the ice might have barred their way. But with the presence of the Night King, his very aura anathema to those wards, the watchers could only pray the structure would hold. John felt a tremor beneath his feet, as if the wall itself trembled. A few stones, hammered in centuries past, dislodged from the walkway. Men clung to the railings, fear sketched across their sooty faces. Then, to John's horror, he saw something that froze his breath. The Night King slowly raised both arms, his cruel gaze fixed on the fortress. This was how Hardhome fell. This was how entire battles turned. Even before he completed the gesture, the scattered corpses that had fallen under the archer's arrows began to twitch. Some of them rose, arrow shafts still embedded in their skulls or ribs. With wet, grating sounds, they joined the ranks of their new brethren. The defenders had succeeded only in enlarging the Night King's army. Jon's mind raced. They had to prevent more carnage. At this rate, every dead body would be turned against them. He shouted to the men, "Pull back into the courtyard. Don't let them scale the wall with your corpses." In truth, it was a desperate order. If the whites could find purchase on the ice, they might begin to climb. Or the Night King might shatter the wall's protective enchantments. Tormund seized Jon's arm. "We're being pinned in, Jon. We can't hold them at the base." Jon answered quietly, "We might have no choice." He peered down again, scanning the white plains, trying to anticipate the White Walker's next move. Another memory of Hardhome seized him, that moment where Jon's eyes locked with the Night King's. A duel of stairs, a silent promise that they would meet again. Now that day had come. Men stationed on the lower walkway began to shout. The whites were clawing at the ice, some scaling with a terrifying single-mindedness. Arrows pinned them to the wall only for them to keep climbing with lifeless determination. "Dragonglass bombs!" someone yelled. A few watchers hurled small clay pots filled with an explosive mixture of oil and ground dragonglass. They exploded among the whites, blasting them from the wall in a hail of black glass and shattered bone. Still, too many were advancing. Tormund urged Jon, "We have to get down there. The men will lose heart if they don't see leadership." Jon swallowed and nodded. Yes, he didn't need to say more. They sprinted back down the icy stairs, Ghost bounding ahead. The courtyard was in a frenzy of motion. Men armed with spears, swords, and axes, wearing whatever mismatched armor they could scrounge. Some of the free folk were similarly armed, though many sported furs and leathers, brandishing crude clubs. Sam was there near a smaller group distributing dragonglass daggers. Jon drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel blade glinting in the dull light. The gates trembled as whites battered against them, wooden timbers cracking under the pressure. "Hold! Hold!" men shouted. They slid heavy iron bars into place, reinforcing the gates. But it was clear it wouldn't last indefinitely. A wave of dizziness overcame Jon, imagining the swarm that awaited them if the gates broke. But amid that dread, a piercing shriek rose above the clamor. Jon looked upward. There, perched on a jagged outcrop of ice near the top of the wall, was the Night King astride an undead dragon. The memory of Viserion, once Daenerys' child, twisted into a pale monstrosity that exhaled frigid blasts capable of shattering stone. The Night King had used the dragon to breach part of the wall further east some time ago, but they had managed to rebuild a portion with an enormous effort of manpower, ice, and stone. Yet that same undead dragon was perched once more, beating its rotting wings as if relishing the impending carnage. Jon's heart hammered. He shouted a frantic command, "Take cover! Archers, aim for the dragon's eyes." But they had little chance at this range. The dragon let out a roar that shook the courtyard. Blue-white frost streamed from its maw. It raked across a portion of the wall, sending chunks of ice tumbling. The men cowered. Jon rushed to the gate, shouting for more men to help brace it. The wood splintered, and an arm of a white slipped through the gap. Others hacked at that arm until it fell away. Then another took its place, pushing and clawing. Suddenly, over the din, the echo of a horn blast from the top of the wall signaled a most unexpected event. The Night King was dismounting his dragon, descending the ice. It was an impossibility to imagine him doing so alone, but for a fleeting moment, it seemed that was exactly his intention. Jon's stomach twisted at the prospect. Was he looking to break the gates himself? Or was he issuing a challenge? A hush rippled through the whites. Though they mindlessly hammered at the gate, there was a strange stutter in their movements, as if some collective awareness had shifted. The White Walkers in their ranks remained poised, waiting. It was then Jon felt a sensation in the air, a crackling hush that reminded him of an oncoming storm. He turned to Tormund, who gave him a bewildered look, and then to Sam, who had joined them. Sam's eyes were wide with alarm. Whatever the Night King intended, it became evident a moment later. He walked along the base of the wall, his pale face tilted upward, scanning the battlements as though searching for someone. He halted, lifted his chin in a silent demand. The message was unmistakable. Come forth. Jon swallowed hard. It was as if some ancient primal chord had been struck, calling for single combat. But there were no rules to be certain of, no guarantee that if Jon met him, the whites would stand down. Yet the Night King seemed to project that challenge as clearly as any spoken words. The alternative was unthinkable. If the Night King unleashed his dragon's full power or assaulted the gate with his legion, Castle Black would be overrun in an hour. Jon looked to Tormund. If it's me he wants, I have to go. No, Tormund growled, eyes flaring. He'll kill you. Then who will lead us? That's exactly what he wants. Jon's voice was level, though his insides churned. Without me, you can still fight. But if he breaks us here, no one else stands a chance. I have to try. They locked eyes, and Tormund's anger softened to resignation. Then I'll come with you, he said, though doubt quavered in his tone. No, Jon replied firmly. If he wants single combat, we have to see if he'll keep his monstrous army at bay. If he doesn't, if it's a trick, then you and the others stay behind these walls and make them pay dearly. Defend the realm as long as you can. Tormund set his jaw, eyes burning with the fierce loyalty that Jon knew so well. You're a fool, Jon Snow, but you're the only fool I'd follow to the ends of the earth. Jon gripped his friend's forearm. Then Sam approached, his face white as the snow around them. He pressed another small pouch of dragonglass dust into Jon's hand, the second one he'd prepared. Don't forget what you learned, he whispered. Strike and don't give him time to react. If you can wound him, do it quickly. Valyrian steel can kill White Walkers. You have to fight him as if he's not mortal. Because he isn't. Jon nodded, swallowing heavily. He turned toward the small sally port, an auxiliary exit that led outside the main gates. A handful of men moved the bar aside, allowing the door to creak open. The swirling wind tore into the courtyard, bringing the stench of death. Jon braced himself and stepped out, Ghost at his side. At the sight of him, the horde of whites halted, forming a ragged half-circle. They were close enough that Jon could see the milky eyes of their corpses, the fragments of icicles clinging to their faces. Not a single living breath among them. It was as if they were all tethered to the Night King's will, waiting for his command. At the center of their ranks stood that dread figure. The Night King exuded a silent power, an aura that made the very air shimmer with cold. Jon moved slowly, Longclaw gripped tight in his right hand, the dragonglass pouch in his left. Ghost padded forward, a low growl vibrating from the direwolf's chest. His white fur bristled, hackles raised. The Night King made no gesture toward the direwolf. His icy gaze remained on Jon. They closed the distance until only a dozen paces separated them. Jon came to a stop, the wind whipping his cloak behind him. Silence reigned. From high on the wall, men peered down, hearts thundering as they witnessed this unimaginable confrontation. In that moment, Jon realized how surreal it was. Two figures standing in a field of snow, one living, one an ancient force of death incarnate. He could almost sense the cold radiating from the Night King's body, as if he carried the essence of winter itself. Slowly, the Night King drew his own sword, a blade forged from some alien ice. Its surface glinted with fractal patterns, sharp and lethal beyond mortal comprehension. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw. His mind raced with Sam's words, with the memory of how he'd once felled a White Walker with a single blow of Valyrian steel. But this was no ordinary White Walker. This was their king. The Night King advanced first, gliding across the snow. Jon circled slightly, mindful of his footwork. Ghost snarled, but Jon murmured a command for him to stay back. He had no desire to see his direwolf face the Night King's wrath. Then, with preternatural speed, the Night King lunged, bringing the ice blade down in an arc aimed at Jon's shoulder. Jon barely managed to raise Longclaw in defense, the clash creating a sharp crack, as if the air itself had splintered. The force of the blow rattled Jon's arms, sending him skidding back a few steps. He recovered, exhaled a frosty breath, and angled his sword. He darted forward with a thrust. The Night King pivoted, parrying with effortless grace. Jon followed with a swift overhead strike, but the Night King slipped aside, moving almost supernaturally. A swirl of snow blew between them, momentarily obscuring Jon's vision. Then the Night King struck again. Jon met the blow, sparks of frost and steel flickering in the cold air. Each clash reverberated in Jon's bones. He had faced formidable swordsmen Qhorin Halfhand, Carl Tanner, even men in the War of the Five Kings, but nothing compared to this relentless, inhuman skill. Overhead, the undead dragon let out another roar, as if cheering its master on. Ghost circled anxiously, growling with deep fury. Jon attempted a feint, stepping inward to slash at the Night King's side. The movement was too slow by a fraction. The Night King caught his blade with the icy sword, twisting with a terrifying strength that nearly tore Longclaw from Jon's grip. Gritting his teeth, Jon managed to hold on, but the angle left his torso open. With a backhanded strike, the Night King slashed across Jon's midsection. Pain flared, though Jon's thick leather and chainmail deflected the worst of it. He staggered, breath ripping from his lungs. The Night King showed no emotion, eyes fixed, posture unchanging. He pressed the advantage, stepping forward in a swirl of pale hair. Jon scrambled to defend himself, managing a desperate block. For a heartbeat, their faces were inches apart. Jon saw the lifelessness in those blue eyes, the chilling emptiness. He pushed back with all his might, disengaging with a grunt. Blood blossomed on Jon's side, but he forced himself to stay upright. He drew a shaky breath. He could not falter. This single combat might be their only chance. In that instant, he remembered the small pouch of dragonglass dust. If he could distract the Night King, perhaps he could fling it at him, or slash him and force the dust into a wound. But the opportunity would be slim. The Night King moved again, this time with a flurry of strikes that forced Jon to retreat step by step, parrying desperately. Each blow threatened to knock Longclaw from his hand. His muscles burned with exertion in the biting cold. The watchers on the wall gasped, hearts in their throats, seeing Jon slowly forced to yield ground. Tormund clenched his fists, cursing under his breath. Sam, white-knuckled, gripped the ramparts, whispering fervent prayers to the old gods, the new, the seven, any who might listen. Then, in a final savage swing, the Night King hammered down at Jon with such force that Longclaw was nearly driven out of Jon's grasp. Jon's knees buckled, and the Night King seized the opening, kicking Jon square in the chest. Jon flew backward, landing hard on the snow. His head spun, breath knocked from his lungs. He forced himself to roll aside as the Night King's sword stabbed the ground where he'd been. Somewhere behind them, Ghost snarled, but the direwolf did not leap in. Jon had commanded him to hold, to let him face this alone. Perhaps Ghost sensed it was the only way. Summoning his last reserves of energy, Jon pushed himself upright. Pain flared in his ribs, a sure sign one was cracked if not broken. His vision flickered with spots of black. The Night King regarded him, tilting his head in that eerie, inhuman manner, as if to say, "This is the best men have to offer?" Jon tightened his hand on Longclaw. He refused to meet the same fate as so many who had fallen. Steeling himself, he lunged forward. This time, instead of aiming for a conventional strike, he swerved at the last instant. The Night King's parry missed by a hair, and Jon's blade slashed across the creature's right arm, opening a thin, glimmering line. A breath of icy mist escaped, as though the Night King's blood were vapor. The creature hissed, recoiling. Jon used that moment to draw the small pouch from his belt. Before the Night King could strike again, Jon hurled a handful of dragonglass dust at the wounded arm. The crystalline shards and powder clung to the gash. Immediately, the Night King's flesh sizzled with a faint crackle of frost, as though the dragonglass were corroding the unnatural tissue. He let out a shriek that pierced the air, a sound that clawed at Jon's ears and rattled the watchers on the wall. Jon pressed the advantage, roaring as he swung Longclaw again. This time, he aimed to sever the wounded arm completely. The Night King jerked backward, moving inhumanly fast despite the injury, and the blow missed. Then, with an enraged surge of power, the Night King backhanded John. The impact slammed John against the frozen ground. His head rocked, pain exploding behind his eyes. For a moment, the world spun. When his vision steadied, he saw the Night King looming above him, left hand raised. Icy shards coalesced in his palm, forming an elongated spear of frost. The Night King lifted it to strike, to end John once and for all. Desperate, John tried to scramble away, but his limbs felt like lead. Suddenly, a white flash of fur leaped between them. Ghost. With a ferocious snarl, the dire wolf latched onto the Night King's wounded arm, teeth sinking into the glimmering laceration. Another shriek echoed from the Night King, furious and pained. He stumbled back, trying to fling Ghost off. The dire wolf held firm, the power of the dragonglass dust inside the wound intensifying the effect. Mist and frost chipped away from the Night King's limb as he struggled with the beast. John seized the chance. Summoning every ounce of will, he staggered to his feet. Longclaw's weight felt immense, but he raised it, ignoring the agony in his side. He glimpsed the Night King slamming a fist into Ghost's flank. Ghost yelped and flew back, landing in the snow with a whimper. Rage and sorrow flared in John's chest. "Ghost!" he cried, but he had no time to check on the dire wolf. The Night King was momentarily exposed, arm outstretched, the wound still sizzling with dragonglass. John rushed forward, letting out a hoarse cry, and drove Longclaw in a powerful thrust aimed for the Night King's chest. The Valyrian steel slid in, meeting a moment of resistance. The Night King's face contorted in shock and fury. His left hand clenched as though to rip John apart with raw magic, but John twisted the blade. A fractal pattern of ice cracks spiraled out from the entry wound, swiftly traveling across the Night King's torso, up to his neck and through his face. The same bluish glow flickered and shattered like glass, splitting him from within. For a single breath, the Night King stared into John's eyes. Then, with a final, haunting cry, his entire form disintegrated into a flurry of crystalline shards. They collapsed into the snow, where they melted into dark water, leaving no trace but an eerie silence. John stood there, stunned, breathing raggedly, Longclaw lowered. The hush was absolute. Not a single wight moved. Then, as if unbound from a spell, their bodies collapsed. One by one, they dropped to the ground, inert. The White Walkers that flanked the Night King shattered in place, their icy armor fragmenting as they perished in unison with their master. The undead dragon high above on the wall let out a ghostly moan, then tumbled from its perch, crumpling into a cascade of bones and rotting flesh. All around John, the army of the dead disintegrated into dust and bone, leaving a wasteland of silent corpses that were no longer reanimated. For a heartbeat, nobody moved on the battlements or in the courtyard. The watchers on the wall stared in disbelief, scarcely able to process what they had just witnessed. Then, a collective roar of triumph and relief erupted. Men cheered, wept, sank to their knees in gratitude. Some embraced each other. Others stood in awe, gaping at John's lone figure in the snow, sword in hand. Tormund was among the first to rush out of the gates, ignoring the giant field of fallen wights, weaving between them until he reached John. "You bloody bastard," Tormund panted, tears in his eyes half frozen. "You did it. You actually did it." John barely heard him, dropping to his knees beside Ghost, whose flank rose and fell in shallow breaths. The dire wolf whined softly, trembling from the blow it had taken. John ran a shaking hand through Ghost's fur. "Easy, Ghost," he whispered. "It's over. You're all right." He pressed his forehead against the direwolf's muzzle, tears blurring his vision. Ghost let out a weak, warm huff. Men from the Night's Watch crowded around, eyes lit with incredulous wonder. Sam pushed forward, breathless, book still clutched under one arm. "John? You're alive!" Sam's voice cracked. He knelt beside John, helping him examine Ghost. "He's hurt, but not fatally, I think. We can treat his ribs, bandage him up." Jon nodded, still in a daze. The swirling snow seemed to hold a new gentleness. Where the Night King had stood, only fragments of ice melted away, leaving the ground muddy and churned from the footsteps of the undead. The wall remained standing, though scarred by frost blasts and battered by the onslaught. The gate, cracked and nearly broken, was still intact. Castle Black stood. The realms of men stood. Jon let out a shaky exhalation, tears freezing on his cheeks. Word spread like wildfire across the fortress and then beyond, carried by ravens to the corners of Westeros. Jon Snow had faced the Night King in single combat at the Wall and emerged victorious. The ancient threat that had loomed for millennia was gone in one stroke. Some men shouted that the long night was ended. Others wept openly. The free folk howled their victory to the skies, stamping their feet in the snow and proclaiming that the Wall had served its purpose one final time. In the immediate aftermath, stunned silence and relief prevailed. Many walked among the fallen whites, verifying that none stirred, that the threat was genuinely gone. There would be weeks of labor to dispose of the remains, to mourn those who had perished in the battle. But for that moment, an astonished joy permeated the cold air. Jon remained outside with Ghost, who slowly regained enough strength to stand, though he favored one side. Jon and Sam led the direwolf back into the courtyard, where men rushed to greet them with cheers. Tormund placed a massive hand on Jon's uninjured shoulder, a grin cracking his bearded face. "I thought that was the end. I swear I did." He laughed, though tears welled in his eyes. "But you proved me wrong, Snow." Jon mustered a faint smile. His vision still spun, and he felt warmth seeping from his side where the Night King's blade had found purchase. "I need a maester," Jon murmured. Sam, noticing, immediately called for help. They guided Jon to the healers. The men parted for him as if he were some legendary hero returned from the brink. In the small infirmary chamber, they laid Jon on a rough pallet. The area was packed with the wounded, moaning softly in pain, as the meager staff did their best. Jon clenched his jaw while a maester peeled back his clothing, revealing the cut across his ribs. Fortunately, the chainmail had absorbed much of the blow, but the gash was deep enough to require stitches. The maester cleaned it, applied poultices to stave off infection, and then sewed the wound with practiced efficiency, ignoring Jon's muffled grunts. Ghost laid in a corner, whining softly. Another helper, a wise woman from among the free folk, was tending to the direwolf's flank, wrapping it in herbal poultices to reduce swelling and bruising. Word reached them that the White Walkers had disintegrated en masse. The whites crumbled into dust, and the undead dragon was nothing but a scattering of bones half buried in the snow. Sam hovered near Jon, brimming with questions. "Jon, how did you? Was it truly just a single thrust of Valyrian steel?" Jon shook his head slightly. His mind felt clouded by exhaustion. "He was faster, stronger. I wouldn't have succeeded without the dragonglass dust." Ghost distracted him. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash over him. It was pure luck and desperation. Sam's face brightened with admiration. "Perhaps, but no one else could have done it. That's more than luck, Jon. You were meant to end this." At that, Jon swallowed. He didn't know how he felt about destiny, but relief flooded him, mixing with sorrow for the lives lost. The prophecy of the prince that was promised, the whispers that had followed him since the truth of his birth emerged. He had no energy left to sort through it. For now, he was content just knowing the threat of the dead was ended. He let his eyes close, giving himself over to much-needed rest. Days passed in a blur of recovery and aftermath. News spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms that the Night King was gone. Some dismissed it as a myth or a rumor, but as ravens reached Winterfell, the Vale, Riverrun, and even King's Landing, the truth became undeniable. Survivors of the battle at the Wall wrote their accounts, testifying to the sight of Jon Snow dueling the dreaded undead monarch. Skeptical lords sent envoys to verify. They found the fields beyond Castle Black littered with the remains of whites, lifeless once more, proof enough for any rational mind. The first significant travelers to arrive at Castle Black in the wake of the victory were Sansa Stark and Arya Stark, who had been at Winterfell, rallying forces against the possibility of the Undead's advance. Alongside them came a retinue of northern bannermen, all prepared to defend the north. They arrived to a scene more triumphant than they could have imagined. The battered fortress was filled with wounded men, but the underlying energy was jubilant. Sansa embraced Jon, her eyes brimming with tears of relief. "When the news came by Raven, I hardly dared believe it," she whispered. "We thought we would be forced to flee south, to gather the living in one last stand somewhere else." She squeezed his hand. "You did this." Arya looked at Jon with her sharp gaze, her expression flicking between pride and a lingering sense of wonder. "You never were good at listening when people said something was impossible." Jon gave a rueful smile. They had changed so much, these siblings he once thought he'd never see again. "No one's more surprised than I am." Outside, Tormund was helping direct teams of Free Folk and Night's Watch members as they burned the last of the white corpses, ensuring no disease would spread. The pungent smoke curled into the sky. A small group of maesters arrived from Winterfell and the Citadel, offering help with the wounded and to document the events for posterity. Jon walked the courtyard, leaning on a makeshift crutch while he recovered from his injuries. Ghost trailed beside him, stitched and still favoring one leg, but restless as ever. Every so often, a man would stop Jon to express gratitude, or bow, which made Jon uneasy. He was no king, he reminded them, though some called him that. A murmur grew among the free folk that Jon Snow was truly someone beyond any mortal lord, referencing old prophecies about men of the true north or the last hero. Others called him the prince that was promised, a moniker once attached to Azor Ahai. Jon found he had little patience for prophecies. He had seen too much death to believe in destiny's gentle guiding hand. Still, the victory was undeniable. In a meeting a few days later with Sansa, Arya, Sam, Tormund, and the Night's Watch officers, they discussed the ramifications. "The threat of the White Walkers is ended," Sansa said. "That changes everything in the political landscape. Daenerys Targaryen will want to hear of this," Sam noted. "She made the war against the dead her own vow, though she was called away by conflicts in the south. She'll be relieved to know it's resolved." Jon nodded. A pang of memory surfaced for the alliance he had forged with Daenerys, the bond they had shared, the knowledge of his Targaryen heritage that complicated everything. But he had never had time to dwell on it. Now, though, with the immediate threat gone, these old burdens might return. "We'll send ravens," Jon said, "but we also need to keep the north stable. The winter storms aren't finished yet, and there are still living enemies who might take advantage of the chaos." Tormund crossed his thick arms. "My people are free to roam again, but we'll stick around a bit longer," he rumbled. "We're done with that damned big war, but you know we'll stand by you if more trouble comes." Despite his own misgivings, Jon felt a warmth at Tormund's loyalty. He clasped Tormund's arm. "Thank you." Arya watched her brother closely. "You risked your life out there. I heard it was the direwolf who saved you at the last moment." Jon nodded, meeting Arya. She tilted her head slightly. "You always were too selfless, Jon, but I'm glad you had help." Her voice, as ever, carried complexities of relief and a well of emotion she rarely showed. In the weeks to follow, Castle Black became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Freed from fear, a steady stream of travelers arrived to see the battlefield or pay respects. There were also those who sought to pay homage to Jon. He found it unnerving, the hero's welcome. He retreated from the crowds whenever possible, preferring to work with the watchmen to rebuild the battered sections of the wall. Tormund and many of the free folk began talking about heading back north of the wall, to reclaim the lands they'd been driven from by the dead. Jon gave his blessing, though he suspected a part of him would want to follow them, to vanish into the wilderness. He was not naive enough to think the world's troubles were over. Humans would always find reasons to wage war among themselves. But for now, the existential threat of the Night King had passed, and that was worth celebrating. He found small joys. Seeing the men laugh again, hearing them make gallows jokes about the cold or the rations, without the shadow of impending doom looming over them. Watching Ghost limp less each day. Sitting with Sam late in the library, hearing him muse about writing an entire volume to chronicle the battles, the significance of Dragonglass, and how it was John who ended the long night. John politely asked Sam not to overemphasize him, but Sam only smiled. It happened, John. People will want to know. Sansa and Arya eventually prepared to return to Winterfell to ensure stability there. Arya teased that she might continue her travels once she was satisfied the North was safe. There are places I've heard about, far beyond the maps, she murmured, eyes gleaming with curiosity. Sansa, more pragmatic, intended to secure alliances, gather harvests for the winter, and see how the realm could rebuild in the wake of so many devastations. And you? She asked John. Will you stay here? John looked around at the fortress that had shaped so much of his life. The Watch needs help rebuilding. We may not face the dead anymore, but the oath remains, to guard the realms of men. He glanced at Tormund, who gave him a knowing nod. For now, I'll stay, yes. Arya and Sansa both hugged him. It was a bittersweet farewell, relief mingled with the sadness of parting. John kissed Sansa's cheek and embraced Arya, feeling the fierce love of a family that had been scattered and broken but somehow persisted. When they departed, John stood on the walkway, watching their caravan fade into the swirling snow southward. Sam stood with him, both men silent for a time. A raven flew overhead, cawing. John wondered if Daenerys or other southern rulers might come north to witness what had happened. Perhaps they would. Perhaps they'd see that the war for humanity's survival had been won by the North's resilience and courage, far from their southern intrigues. A quiet peace settled over the wall in the months that followed. Snowdrifts piled high, storms came and went. The men of the Night's Watch repaired gates, replaced lost supplies, scouted the area for any lingering pockets of undead. None were found. The free folk who remained sometimes ventured into the wilderness, returning with hunts or game, all of which was shared. The bond between them was cemented by the memory of the terror they had faced together. From time to time, someone would ask John to recount the duel with the Night King. He always hesitated, feeling the swirl of dread, desperation, and raw luck that defined that moment. He spoke plainly. I did what I had to do. I nearly died. Some recognized that humility as the hallmark of true heroism, while others yearned for grand tales. A few travelers tried to bestow lavish gifts on him. He quietly refused them, directing any resources to the men of the Watch. The more flamboyant rumors painted him as a demigod with a flaming sword, or as an avatar of the old gods. John found such tales unsettling. He knew too well the cost of that confrontation. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast a golden light over the endless snow, John walked beyond the gates with Ghost at his side. The direwolf's injuries had healed well, leaving only a faint scar. The sky was clear, the cold biting but invigorating. Out there, in the wide tundra, the shattered remains of the undead dragon had long been hauled away, bone fragments burned. The final resting place of the Night King was nothing more than churned earth where ice had melted. All was still. John knelt and ran his gloved hand through the snow. He felt a curious emptiness. For so long, his life had been shaped by the looming threat of the others. Now that it was gone, what was left? Duty to the Watch, yes. Concern for the North, yes. And perhaps some desire to find a semblance of peace, if that were possible. Ghost nuzzled his shoulder, exhaling warm breath. John smiled faintly. We did it, he murmured. We actually did it. Standing, he gazed north, to the heart of the lands beyond the wall, where the sun painted the horizon in soft oranges and pinks. He wondered if any new horrors lurked beyond the known edges of the world. Perhaps other threats would rise in time, such was the way of things. But for now, the greatest menace ever known to the living was ended. That was enough. He turned and walked back through the gates. In the time that followed, more ravens came from south of the neck. Daenerys had received the message. She reportedly wept with relief that the living had triumphed, though rumor had it she was still entangled in political strife. John felt a pang of sympathy for her predicament. Even though the White Walkers were gone, the mortal Game of Thrones continued. Yet one letter from her arrived addressed specifically to him, marked with her seal. Sam placed it in John's hands carefully, as if passing on a great responsibility. In her letter, Daenerys expressed her gratitude, her relief, and her hope to see him again. She wrote of the dream she once had, that they would break the wheel together. Now that the undead threat was ended, she believed it might be possible to focus on a new realm, free of tyranny. She also acknowledged how complicated their relationship had become after the truth of his parentage was revealed. Yet she ended the note by affirming her desire for peace in the Seven Kingdoms, and invited him to King's Landing to discuss a new alliance. John sighed, folding the parchment. He shared the contents only with Sam, wanting to keep the details private otherwise. He knew the realm needed leadership, but he wasn't sure he was the right man to provide it. Still, he planned to visit the South eventually to see if he could help shape the peace. In a sense, he owed it to everyone who had fought and bled for this victory. For the moment, though, Castle Black needed him. Through winter's deepening chill, John oversaw the distribution of supplies, the forging of new alliances between the Free Folk and the Night's Watch, and the reinforcing of the wall's weak points. Even if the walkers were gone, savage storms and other natural threats would persist. Brigands and bandits might roam in the uncertain times. The Watch would endure, fulfilling its ancient vow in a new age. Every day at dusk, John took a solitary walk along the top of the wall, Longclaw at his side, Ghost trailing behind. He'd pause at the highest battlement, scanning the horizon, recollecting that fearsome day when the sky had darkened with the Night King's approach. He remembered the terror in men's voices, the swirl of snow, the final thrust of his sword. Sometimes the memory made him shake. Sometimes it made him quiet and pensive, but it always made him grateful for the reprieve they had won. One evening, Tormund joined him unexpectedly, carrying a flask of strong spirits. "Still looking north, Snow?" Tormund asked, handing John the flask. John took a swig, the fiery liquid burning his throat in a strangely reassuring way. "Force of habit," he admitted, coughing slightly. Tormund let out a booming laugh that echoed. "We're alive, John, and we've got no more dead men chasing us. Maybe it's time for you to stop keeping watch up here in the cold and come join the living. At least for a mug of ale or two." John gave him a small smile. A tempting offer, Tormund. Truly. He stayed a few more moments, gazing at the pale glow of the moon on the snow. Tormund waited patiently, swigging from his flask and grinning into the wind. Finally, John turned. "Let's go. I could do with some warmth." They descended into the fortress, where a low, comforting fire crackled in the hearth. Men who used to be strangers, Free Folk and Night's Watch, shared stories of hunts, old battles, and the day they thought the world would end. A few men tried to coax John into telling the tale of the Night King's defeat one more time. He politely declined, but Tormund stepped in, weaving a grand narrative that was half exaggeration, making John sound twice as tall and far more heroic. The hall erupted with laughter and applause. John, content to let Tormund spin his yarn, sipped his ale. He realized these men needed the legend now. They had endured unspeakable terror. They deserved to celebrate, to believe in heroes. If that gave them a sense of hope, he would endure the myth-making. Tomorrow, there would be more repairs, more responsibilities, more preparations for a future that had once seemed impossible. But for tonight, at least, there was a comfortable fire and laughter in the company of survivors. He watched Ghost doze by the hearth, the direwolf's ears flicking at the sound of raucous cheer. He saw Sam in conversation with a maester, no doubt retelling some arcane detail about dragonglass. He saw men who once scorned each other's backgrounds, crows and wildlings, passing each other drinks, and he felt, perhaps for the first time, that there could be a real future for all of them. Later that night, when the fires died down and most men drifted to sleep, John stepped outside into the courtyard. The air was frigid and still. He noticed a single figure standing at the gate, peering at the horizon. A young recruit, barely in his teens, assigned to the Night's Watch in place of a punishment from some southern lord. The boy had terror in his eyes, as if expecting the dead to rise again any minute. John walked up to him and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Nothing out there now but snow and wind," John told him quietly. The boy looked up at John, eyes wide. "But if they come back?" "They won't," John promised gently. "The Night King is dead. We're safe." The boy swallowed. "I was afraid. My father told me stories of the long night about the White Walkers. We never thought they were real until—" He shivered, recalling the horrors he had witnessed upon his arrival. John nodded. "I once thought the same, but sometimes we have to face our nightmares. And sometimes we're lucky enough to win." He squeezed the boy's shoulder. "Go on and get some rest if you can." The recruit hesitated, then nodded and headed off, leaving John alone by the gate. The flickering torchlight cast shadows on the snowdrifts. John stepped forward, placing his palm against the frozen wood. He remembered the endless nights of terror, the creeping dread that had haunted him. A shudder rippled through him, not from cold but from memory. Then he exhaled, letting the tension go. Somewhere above, the moon gleamed, crisp and radiant. The Night's Watch was a diminished order, yet it still existed, fulfilling its duty. John felt a surge of quiet pride, not in himself, but in the resilience of these people who had rallied to hold the line against the dead. Tormund's booming laughter echoed from inside, drifting across the yard. John allowed himself a faint smile. Tomorrow, he would see to more repairs, read the new letters from the south, and plan a trip to Winterfell or King's Landing if the realm demanded it. But for this moment, he stood by the gate, survivor, defender, reluctant hero to some. The wind stirred around him, carrying the faint smells of wood smoke and pine. In that swirl of air, he thought he sensed a final farewell from the ghosts of the past. Ygritte, the friends he had lost, the countless nameless dead, the echoes of the White Walkers that had, at last, been silenced. He stepped back inside. The fort's torchlit corridors were familiar and reassuring. Ghost followed, tail swishing, leaving footprints in the fresh powder. The memory of that duel remained vivid, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the long night would not descend upon them again. He had faced the darkest horror, and though it nearly broke him, he emerged triumphant. The realm was free to shape its own destiny, unshackled from the chains of the undead. And thus Jon Snow carried on, one more living soul among many, forging a new life in the aftermath of legend. His was not a boastful existence nor a kingly one, but he wore contentment like a quiet cloak, contentment in the knowledge that, for all the tragedies and mistakes, for all the battered ghosts haunting him, he had done what was necessary. The memory of ice still cut at his dreams sometimes, but the warmth of dawn banished it, day after day. If ever the realm needed him again, he would be there, though he hoped it would never require such desperation. For now, the realm could mend and heal. For now, the living were simply that, alive, unburdened by the threat of the dead. The wall stood eternal, crowned in snow, but its watch was no longer overshadowed by hopelessness. A new dawn rose over the north, painting the sky in fragile golds and pinks. Jon Snow and the men of the Night's Watch greeted it, battered but unbeaten, with hearts that dared to hope for a better tomorrow.